The Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk with retired Marine Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer. Now, here's Hal.
Welcome to STRAT. Welcome to Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. There have been so many things going on that I could not land on just one topic. And I think next time I'm actually going to interview somebody again. It's been a long time since I did that. But I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about Minnesota, what's going on there, talk about a little bit of kind of cross-referencing to what appears to be the next stage of confrontation, which will be in California. And then I'm going to finish up talking about what's going on in Iran and what that may lead to. So it's going to be a pretty broadly covered thing. Huge strategic import. All three of these places, it's going to affect markets, it's going to affect trade, it's going to affect how we're doing things in the United States across the board. They all have a strategic position in these things. Even if you don't see it right away, you definitely will see it indirectly in terms of what's going on. And because of that, I felt it important to talk about all this stuff. Well, first off, big thing. First, Minnesota. Minnesota, of course, has seen this massive surge of federal agents and officers supporting the ICE mission, finding illegal immigrants and, quote, rounding them up, unquote. And last report, there's about 3,000 federal, and they keep saying ICE agents. They could be deportation officers. They could be special agents that have been detailed to support ICE. There's a lot of different law enforcement presence there. Customs Border Patrol has folks on the streets doing stuff. All of them engaging in what some would say was a very aggressive immigration enforcement operation across the board. I should mention Minneapolis is not the only place in the country where this is going on, but it is going on in Minneapolis. What they're encountering in Minneapolis and Minnesota, though, is a population, a very large chunk of the population that is very actively protesting what they're doing, protesting their actions on the street, and in many cases trying to do things where they're obstructing, however that defines, but trying to stop this immigration enforcement action from taking place. And in some cases, they do show clear intent to obstruct, and this is where it's causing some issues. When they get in there and they obstruct some of these law enforcement events, federal law enforcement events, when they're doing that, this kind of ups the potential outcome from being a peaceful protest to something not so much a peaceful protest. And we've had two of these encounters where federal agents or federal officers actually shot and killed two protesters. And in each case, obviously, these shootings, these killings were very controversial. There's a lot of question about what were the officers doing when they did it. Was there confusion? Were these, quote, good shootings, bad shootings? And honestly, I think that Secretary of DHS, Kristi Noem, may have tried to go out there and vigorously defend her agency, but might have got out, as someone once put very well, got out in front of her skis, unquote. And I always find that to be, for some reason, that phrase sticks even with people who don't really ski. They understand. The idea is you've shifted your weight forward, you got out over your skis, and you're setting yourself up for a fall. And that's kind of what's happened. Is I think they got out there trying to aggressively defend stuff. And not to say that there's any malicious intent. Certainly no intent to. Nobody got up in the morning saying, I'm going to go kill a protester. What had happened was they may have just ended up in situations where things got really things went horribly wrong, and a couple of protesters were killed. We're going to talk, that's part of it. And part of it is that some of the statements that were coming out of DHS, CBP, didn't match video of the encounters themselves. And some things were said were, of course, in this hypercharged partisan environment, they would say, oh, they were lying. Well, I don't know if they were lying, or they may have been repeating something that was a mistake early on. For example, with the most recent shooting, which was 37-year-old ICU nurse at the VA, Alex Predis. Sadly, they were saying, well, he was brandishing a weapon. It turns out he was not brandishing a weapon. He was brandishing a cell phone. And of course, that thing turned into something that ended up where he was shot and killed, although he did have a weapon on him, and he did have a second very high capacity magazine full of rounds on him. So he may have, as Christy Nome said, have dozens of rounds. That I got to tell you, right there, that's just, at the very least, going into a situation like that, particularly in a situation where you may be confronting law enforcement and carrying a weapon like that, really bad idea. And I say this whether you're more on the left or more on the right. On the right, I have seen individuals, vigorously protesting their open carry rights by going to places like state capitals or courthouses and wandering around with semi-automatic rifles and more gear hanging over them and other weapons than you can shake a stick at, saying, well, this is my Second Amendment rights. It may be, but I will tell you, if there's a confrontation, that could go they're just fortunate that has not turned into something much worse, but that could go south very quickly. In this case, when they got into a tussle, it went south, and I think some clear mistakes were done. Now, Minnesota Governor Walz has been saying some things which I want to take exception with. First off, he said these federal officers or federal agents are, quote, untrained, and trying to make it look like they were just rushed through something, they're thrown out in the streets, they don't know what they're doing, and they're just engaging in some sort of gang activity or something with what they're doing. That is absolutely not true. The officers, as I know, have been in for years. The officers involved in the shootings, they had been trained. For anyone out there training for becoming a CBP officer, for example, you have to go through at least about 5 months of training. It is very rigorous. It's back at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I've been back there on training. I have seen them go through the training while they're out there. It is very intense training. By comparison, the training that a Minneapolis police officer goes through the academy is about 3.5, maybe 4 months. So it's actually a shorter training thing. So when they say these guys are untrained, that's not correct. Now, they are not necessarily trained in all the same things, but believe me, if you're a Customs Border Patrol officer, you're trained to take someone down, you're trained to handcuff them, you're trained to arrest people, you're trained to do all these things that they do. You may not be trained in civil unrest that much. I imagine that's something they're working on right now, but you have been trained. So this narrative that I've heard put out by state officials in Minnesota and city officials in Minneapolis that these federal officers are untrained or these federal agents are untrained is just not true. That is not correct. Now, are CBP and ICE highly trained to work civil unrest like what they're doing with on the streets? I don't think the curriculum of years back certainly supports it. I don't know if they've been getting new curriculum on how to do this stuff. That's very possible. I imagine there is something now where they're being taught how to deal with this. But the sort of protest stuff that they're seeing are just things that they just never would see before. And a lot of this is being really pushed by the governor and the mayor making comments about, go out there, be witness, go out there, don't let them just take these people and violate constitutional rights. The language for many would incentivize them to do things that they may not be doing otherwise. And I just find that is throwing fuel on the fire when they say that stuff, and it's increasing the chance of a confrontation. And I would say, before anybody says, well, it was all ICE and CBP and stuff, they would have been out there if ICE, yes, they wouldn't have been out there if ICE and CBP hadn't been saying that. Well, would they have been out there doing would the protesters have been out there doing what they were doing if they had not felt they had the encouragement of the governor, the mayor, and others? You can always go back and Monday morning quarterback and examine this stuff, but I think there's a lot of things to look at there. Now, under the Constitution, everyone has an intrinsic right to protest. You got the Second Amendment rights. However, under the Constitution and established in international laws, nation states have the rights to enforce who can immigrate into their countries, and of those who come in, who will become citizens, and those who don't become citizens, whether they can stay or they have to leave. These are not wild new concepts. This has been around for a very, very long time. State and local governments do not have jurisdiction in that area. Yes, they say sovereign states, but I'm going to say something to the far left that I've been saying, something about the far left I've been saying about the far right for a very long time with the sovereign citizen movement. First off, they're wrong, all right? That's flat out wrong. The states do not have this unchecked sovereignty thing. The states are part of the United States of America. The sovereign nation state is the United States of America. It is not the state. Yes, there is a statement about that anything that's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution is that the states maintain sovereignty over. But that's not what it means. And this is not something where they get to go in and say, yes, we have sovereignty over this. Now, can the state investigate the actions of federal officials? They probably can investigate. Do they have standing to do something in federal court? That's something the courts are going to have to take a look at. One thing I find very dangerous is this idea that, first off, the federal government as a whole can't investigate itself. You know, the idea that the FBI can't come in and investigate what DHS was doing, that somehow Minneapolis PD or state troopers in Minnesota are going to do a better investigation than the FBI. That's pure political fantasy land. That's just not going to happen. The FBI will do a far better job in whatever has to be done there. And honestly, the DHS has investigators in its own organization that could do a pretty good job investigating their own personnel. They do that all the time. You know, this idea that the state should go out there and be able to do that, you can imagine on a national level how much chaos that would be if every time that there was federal government was cracking down on some corrupt politician or some politician engaged in fraud or other things, that they turn around and say, quick, arrest them. That happened in Los Angeles, very close to home. I recall when the FBI ran an undercover operation with the jail, and they had a confidential informant in the jail, and he was talking about deputies, at least one deputy, maybe more, that were doing things where they would get paid off to deliver cell phones and stuff like that. The FBI was like, that's a pure classic FBI public corruption investigation. You know, nothing strange about that. The sheriff in Los Angeles, Sheriff Baca, was just enraged. How dare the FBI do this when we work with him on so many other things? He actually sent deputies to that special agent's home to try and arrest her for doing that operation. And yes, there was a fierce standoff, and there were a lot of phone calls between the FBI and the sheriff in Washington, D.C., and the state and everything, explained to him, no, you can't do that. That is wrong. And I just point that as an example of one of the reasons why you don't want. And as it turns out, Sheriff Baca eventually went to prison, as did his undersheriff, because they were basically wrongdoers. They were corrupt. They were doing things that were, flat out wrong and illegal and violating federal law, and they went to prison for it. That's the way the system's supposed to work. All right. So anyway, I just want to point that out, because there is this kind of sort of naive thing that, well, Minneapolis PD should be investigating all these ICE agents. No, they should not. All right. Minneapolis PD does not cooperate with ICE, does not cooperate with these immigration enforcement operations. They do not support them. They will not go in there with them. They will not give them information on where these illegal aliens are, or these criminal illegal aliens are. And therefore, ICE has to do that on their own. And that's one of the reasons they have so many people on the ground. This goes to another issue, okay? If the state and the city are saying, we're not going to enforce federal law, we're not going to cooperate with federal law enforcement, in fact, we're going to try and stop federal law enforcement from enforcing federal law in our state, you get into the language that falls into the Insurrection Act and what an insurrection is, all right? And if the Insurrection Act is actually declared or invoked by the president, which he has the power to do, if he invokes the Insurrection Act, not to say there can't be federal legal review on what he did, but if he does that, that means federal troops are no longer restricted from doing law enforcement functions. President Trump has talked about maybe he should invoke the Insurrection Act. He just more recently said that what the governor of Minnesota and the mayor of Minneapolis are doing were, quote, inciting an insurrection, unquote. That's the sort of things that go into whether the Insurrection Act would be invoked, would end posse comitatus compliance, because basically you're saying this state is insurrecting. And if you go back in history, there have been a number of things where states have simply not wanted to follow the federal government. Federal statutes play a big role in defining what prosecuting, what an insurrection is. 18 U.S.C. 23 criminalizes inciting, assisting, or engaging in rebellion against the authority of the United States and its laws. I have a question for you. Does it look like what Minnesota and Minneapolis is doing, what the mayor and the governor are doing, would fit into that? And I can tell you there are a lot of lawyers that would line up and say, yes, they are. All right. I'm sure they would turn around and say, no, they're not. But I'm just saying that that's in the law. The statute imposes some pretty severe consequences, fines, imprisonment for up to 2 years. So there's a lot that goes into this. Then there's another relevant statute, 18 U.S.C. 2384, which targets seditious conspiracy. Basically, it makes it illegal for 2 or more persons to conspire to overthrow the government of the United States. Now, I haven't seen that in this, so I don't imagine that's going to come up. But the first one, all right, 2383, probably will come up as something that the White House may be citing. And I think that this has been talked about before, that they got to be careful with their language, just like Kristi Noem has to be careful with some of her language. Waltz and, Governor Waltz and Mayor Frey have to be careful about these things because they're saying things that could be cited under a 2383 action in that regard. Is Minnesota defying federal actions? Law enforcement there. Yeah, they are. Did Arkansas and Georgia defy federal law enforcement actions under Eisenhower and Kennedy, respectively, in trying to oppose the desegregation of schools? Yes. They did. And in both those cases, Eisenhower and Kennedy invoked the Insurrection Act. In one case, I believe it was Kennedy, he federalized the Georgia National Guard to stop the governor of Georgia from using them to defy federal authority and the Supreme Court in allowing or enabling the desegregation of the University of Alabama. Very clear. I think that was one of the great moments in our history, when Kennedy basically took this white supremacist, racist governor and basically brought him to heel, so to speak, and said, no, you cannot use their stuff. I say that because Waltz has been talking about bringing out the National Guard in Minnesota, to support Minneapolis PD and state troopers. And the question is, what do you mean support? Support what? Support trying to block federal law enforcement for immigration? That, again, falls into that language. Now, on the federal side, President Trump has pointed to the 11th Airborne Division, about 1,500 troops there that might come out of Alaska. He could also, if he wanted to, federalize the Minnesota National Guard and literally deny their use to the governor for any purpose. And now that will be probably argued in court. In fact, I guarantee that will be argued in court, federal court, but that's power that the president does have. All right. And, and that's what's happening there. Now, what about California? Well, California has also been opposed to immigration enforcement by the Trump administration. They also have been accused, like Minnesota has, of engaging in large-scale federal fraud, or I should say fraud involving federal funds. And it just happened that there's been a lot of reports coming out that as soon as this Minnesota thing and this fraud investigation is kind of, well underway or whatever, the next thing that the Trump administration is going to really focus on is all the fraud being done in California. Now, some of the things. It's very clear, as what's coming out, that Governor Waltz knew about the fraud involving funds, particularly going to the Somali child care centers, and some of that money actually ended up going back to Somalia and actually was paying Al-Shabaab, a terrorist group aligned with Al-Qaeda. So basically you had U.S. taxpayers funding an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia. That doesn't go over too well. He did nothing. He knew about this, but he wasn't doing anything about it. Very similar to California. They're going to get into, did Gavin Newsom know about all this fraud? And I'm going to say, yeah, he probably did. And will he get it? And what did that go to do? And that could be a big problem. One of the things that, they bring up, California is a sanctuary state, and there's sanctuary cities in California. And that is one of the things that basically is defying federal immigration enforcement. So I imagine they're going to focus on that. And then let's not forget that California also has they didn't want to follow the rules on, conflicts of interest with federal funds, corruption with federal funds, defrauding federal funds, contracting using federal funds. So there are state agencies that were empowered by the federal government to manage federal programs, federally sponsored programs, getting federal funds in California years back. said, no, we get the money, but there's no strings attached, and we can do what we want. Federal government has never cracked down on that. That went all the way to the state Supreme Court. They have never cracked down on those findings, and now they sit there where the Trump administration could literally cite those things and say, we're not saying that your agencies can accept federal funds or be an instrumentality for a federal agency. You've already stipulated that they cannot be an instrumentality for a federal agency, which means they cannot receive federal funds. So I think California's got a pretty tough position there. And that could lead to potential, if it gets big enough, they could lead to potential insolvency of state government. They lose their federal funds. And since that stuff goes back the better part of 2 decades, you're not talking losing $170 billion this year. You're talking about $2.5 to $3 trillion going over the last couple of decades that suddenly comes under assessment. All right, that's enough about the domestic side. Let me switch over to Iran. President Trump, a couple of weeks ago, it appeared over the last couple of weeks, it appeared that we might be doing strikes in Iran. And President Trump was very clear, saying this whole, basically this slaughter of protesters on the streets of Tehran and other cities throughout Iran by the regime had to end. It had to stop. And they were getting right on the cusp of the regime doing a bunch of high-profile executions, a lot of hangings. And President Trump said, if you don't stop, that we're going to launch. And the Iranian regime appeared to blink, if you will. They stopped that. It wasn't clear if they blinked on killing protesters on the streets. But the reason I bring this out is because there's now reports in Time Magazine, Jerusalem Post, and elsewhere that on the 8th and 9th of January, about 30,000 protesters may have been killed. And this is taken by, not from just reports or somebody saying something. This is being taken, a lot of it, by satellite photos, where they went down, they looked at the number of people, the body bags on the streets, they looked at everything that was out there, and they started doing that very meticulous, very difficult math thing where they're trying to figure out how many people may have been killed, and then fusing that with other intelligence, and they came up with, during those couple days, there may have been 30,000, which, as you know, it wasn't just those 2 days that people were being killed. So now you extrapolate out, you go, there could be 40,000 plus people that may have been protesters that may have been killed by the regime. Word from coming out of Iran now is that the streets are dead. They're being patrolled by these religious zealots that, like the Basij group, which is kind of this militia under the government, very, very extreme. The Revolutionary Guard Corps, which again are the religious zealot side of their paramilitary forces, that they're out there, and if anybody comes out after hours, that they scoop them up. What businesses are open have been basically forced to be open by the regime under the most dire threat you can possibly imagine if they didn't open. And so you have a society that is shell-shocked, it's in mourning, they don't know what to do. You have an economy that is completely fallen apart. You have Khamenei, who reportedly has literally gone underground. He is actually hiding out in bomb shelters because he's absolutely sure that the Trump administration is going to do a big strike on him, which gets to my next point. One of the things when we tied up the Gerald R. Ford Terror Task Force and the Expeditionary Ready Group with the Marine Expeditionary Unit down off Venezuela was it threw all of our Navy math worldwide off kilter. So we didn't have what we would like, which is we'd like a carrier task force sitting off the coast of Iran ready to do something. So we have been steaming over the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Task Force Group and a bunch of surface combatants with Aegis anti-air capability. And they're coming on station here very shortly. Why is this important? One of the big considerations, and certainly a lot of pressure President Trump was getting when he was talking about doing strikes, came from Saudi Arabia and a number of Gulf states that said, please don't do this because we don't have the air defense assets in place to defend against the retaliation strike that we know is going to come from Iran. And they knew it was going to be big. And we had to look at it and say, I'm not sure that we can even defend our own bases over there against whatever Iran's going to launch back as a retaliatory strike. So we needed to move all these naval combatants back into place so we could, A, launch strikes from the ship. And that if you launch them from the ship, then we're not launching them from a land base. And that way, Iran says we're going to strike wherever these things came from. It's a carrier task force sitting out at sea with all the defensive layers that it has, as opposed to the Al Udeid air base sitting in Qatar. And so that kind of limits, to some extent, what Iran might strike as a counterstrike. That's big. Now those Aegis missile frigates and cruisers are getting in place. The carrier task force is getting in place to support this thing. So what does this all mean? What this all means is now you have an even more compelling reason, because of the sheer number of protesters killed, why President Trump needs to do a strike in support of that activity to basically disable those who are killing protesters. That seems to be growing. I'm sure some would say, oh, no, you don't want to do that because you're just going to strengthen the regime's hand and stuff. I'm sure that they've been working through all the math on this to try and figure out what they should strike and what would not be counterproductive, what would support the protesters and what would go against the protest movement and what would indirectly support the regime. And they're probably working all these things out. So these are all big considerations of doing. So all that stuff to do that is getting in place, which means now President Trump has less reasons not to strike Iran. And Iran, it doesn't appear to be getting any better. So that could happen. The other thing I just want to kind of go back to is we might see President Trump invoke the Insurrection Act very soon, like this coming week. I think that could happen. I think it's a realistic possibility. And I think we could also see with that moving federal troops from Alaska, from 11th Airborne, possibly in there, and maybe even federalizing the Minnesota National Guard. I could see that too. So what does the future hold? Well, I think the future holds some very interesting things happening in Minnesota and California, and some really, really interesting things happening in Iran and what that might do to change the entire math of the Middle East and, for that fact, the globe. Thanks for listening, Strat. Please go visit stratpodcast.com. You can also go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV. You can always go to my website, www.gripsa, G-R-I-P, for Global Risk Intelligence and Planning, SA.com. And hopefully you'll listen to the next one, and pretty soon we're going to have some more guests on, so won't be just listening to me.
STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk with Hal Kempfer, is presented by the Mutual Broadcasting System and is always accessible at stratpodcast.com, as well as most leading podcast portals, including Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. For more of Hal Kempfer's current events media appearances, please visit halkempfertv.com. Be sure to like and subscribe to STRAT at your favorite podcast provider.